what are human rights, I say they're basically how do you want to be treated is the same thing as how others should be treated. It's basic dignity. I should not be able to say everybody in a red, is that red? A red jacket should be arrested. It's a violation of her rights, not to mention it's pretty arbitrary. What the global community did following the Second World War in 1945 was it said, we have to establish basic standards of how we treat each other. And those standards shouldn't be violated. And most importantly, governments who have the power and the resources to do what they want in the name of maintaining law and order shouldn't be able to do what they want to anybody, when they want, and how they want. And so they negotiated a treaty led in large part by the United States called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And from that document, which is the basic founding document of the United Nations, you have a whole set of different things called fundamental human rights, both economic, social rights, like the right to housing, the right not to be hungry, the right to go to school, the right not to be discriminated against. And then you have the civil and political rights. We can sit in this room and talk about whatever we want without being arrested. We have the right not to be, we can assemble, we can express ourselves, and we can actually protest. One of the fundamentals in all of these rights, of course, is the right to life and liberty. In other words, you shouldn't be killed arbitrarily. You shouldn't be at risk of being killed. And that's where the work on the Arms Trade Treaty comes in. Excuse me, the arms trade. I keep on jumping straight to that because for me, I worked on both of them. Amnesty International was formed in 1961, and it's based on the idea that everyday normal people, just like us, have to be involved in fighting for rights. Because after they negotiated all of these agreements, the governments completely forgot about them and said, we'll take care of it and manage it. And so they still continue to violate people's rights. If you had a disagreement with your government, they could arrest you. If you wrote something that they didn't like, they could arrest you, or they could detain you, or they could fine you. So organizations began to come up that said, we have the right to challenge these governments and to try to embarrass them about what they do. And the organization began to work on torture. You have a right not to be tortured. You have a right to fair trial. You know, things that a lot of things that will seem familiar to you here in the United States are not present in other countries. And in a way, my organization is about trying to standardize the fact that each of us have individual rights to do what we want to do, as long as they're nonviolent and as long as they don't violate someone else's rights. When we began our work, there were already conflicts. Conflicts, unfortunately, are part of human history and human nature. We believe as an organization that if you respect rights and you hold governments to rights, there's a chance that you can prevent and minimize conflict. But we don't ever delude ourselves that conflict is avoidable, because people want different things and they're not infinite resources. But in our work, we began to realize that a lot of the conflicts in many parts of the world were incredibly linked, or very closely linked, to weapons, to arms. And we found that some of the leading countries that were also doing human rights work or setting up international human rights standards were also the ones manufacturing and selling guns. And when you talk about weapons, let's put off the aircraft carriers and the tankers and the Air Force, and that kind of thing. We're talking about small weapons on light and light arms. In other words, literally the handguns, the AK-47s. Those are the things that are killing people. One of my colleagues told me that a couple of different organizations sat around one day and said, we have got to take on this issue of small arms and the trade of small arms and the lack of regulation. In other words, at that time, there was no single standard that said, I can't sell to that table because that table has just committed genocide. There was no single definition of what constituted a dangerous weapon or what didn't. There were multiple different trade treaties that allowed almost anyone who produced weapons to sell to anybody that they wanted to and not worry about the consequences. The consequences were pretty significant. If you look at a conflict in my part of the region, which is where I focus is Africa, you can look at Sudan, you can look at South Sudan, you can look at the Democratic Republic of the Congo, you can look at the Central African Republic, you can look at the former Somalia. Africa is unfortunately full of conflicts, all of them driven by weapons. Africa doesn't produce guns. So where are these weapons coming from? They're coming from other places in the world. Why are they coming in even if there's conflict? Because there's no regulation. There's no oversight. And what are those weapons doing? How many of you know about the global refugee crisis? Do you know how many people there are that are displaced at the moment in 2019? Anyone to take a guess?
5 million.
5 million. Oh, you got to be more creative here. Keep on going.
75 million?
Now, you've gone over, but 68 million people globally displaced. That's the entire population of France. Displaced around the world. Which region in the world do you think has the most of that 68 million?
The Middle East?
No.
The Americas?
No.
Europe.
No.
Africa.
Thank you. 28 million people displaced in Africa. All the numbers that you mentioned about the Middle East, and those are terrible. That's Yemen, that is Iran, Iraq, excuse me, not Iran, it's Iraq, it's Syria. Those are indeed the largest pockets of individual displaced persons, but in total, Africa accounts for literally 1/3 of the whole displaced population. That's the if it were the United States, the only two states that would have more people than that would be Texas and New York. That's an incredible statistic. The 68 million one, nobody really cares about because it's France. So, but think about that. That's 68 million people, and all of those people, that means that they're displaced, they don't have jobs, they're dependent on food. God knows how many of them have been injured. They are in refugee camps, and they don't have a future because they are not going to be integrated into the countries that they're in, with a few exceptions. They can't go back to the places that they fled. They're stuck. And that's going to be a problem for all of us because that's a large population of people not to know what to do with and not doing anything. The reason I mention that statistic is because it's linked to conflict, and conflict is driven by weapons and arms. And we decided that we couldn't do work on the right to free expression, the right to free association, unless we actually took a job to try to stop the displacement of people that were being caused by weapons. And so we decided we were going to try to regulate the global arms trade. We were initially, people said, oh, that's crazy. Nobody's going to do that because gun manufacturing, weapons productions, weapons sales are not only financially very lucrative, they are almost in many cases considered part of a nation's national security. In other words, nothing gets in the way of national security, and so these countries were never going to allow, they were never going to report how many guns they sold, they were never going to report who they sold them to, and they were never going to allow anyone to say, well, you shouldn't be able to sell them to this country. But we said, well, you know what, we have to do it anyway. And so that was the work on the arms trade treaty. But I want to go back now and talk about the actual arms trade itself. How many of you here know what happened yesterday with Saudi Arabia? Did anybody listen to the news? Not Bob Mueller, but yesterday President Trump vetoed a resolution in Congress that basically said the United States was no longer going to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia. We expected that, and we didn't have enough votes to override his veto. So that means that business as usual is going to continue. How many of you know what's going on in the country of Yemen? You can just raise your hand. There's a civil war in Yemen, and it's between two proxy forces. One basically supported by the Iranian coalition, and it's called the Houthis, and then the other, the existing government that is backed by the government of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The Yemen conflict has killed millions of people. It has created a humanitarian crisis, and it's destroyed what little infrastructure, food production. Yemen is not just it's a failed state, and it's been destroyed deliberately by these two factions that are fighting. The Iranian-backed side has committed terrible human rights violations. No question about that. The Saudi-backed side has committed war crimes also, and they've bombed civilian targets. They have bombed funerals. They have blockaded humanitarian assistance. They've done things that a government shouldn't be allowed to do. And so groups like mine said, you can no longer sell weapons because, of course, the Saudis and the UAE rely on weapons from the United States. And we said that the United States couldn't do that anymore because they were basically not only allowing US weapons to commit war crimes, but they were also basically saying it's fine to kill people, we don't really care about Yemenis. And so Congress actually agreed, and they said we're no longer going to allow the administration to sell weapons to the Saudis, and of course that's what President Trump vetoed last night. The really interesting thing here is that Saudi Arabia also sells weapons to the government of Sudan. The Gulf states sell weapons to the government of Sudan. I mentioned Sudan earlier as one of the conflict zones in Africa. Since it gained independence in 1957, Sudan has been, unfortunately, at war between what is predominantly a Muslim north and a Christian animist south. That conflict lasted from the 1950s until the early 2000s, and then there was finally a peace deal, and the animist south and Christian South was able to separate and form the new country of South Sudan. But in the process of that Sudanese government was not only attacking and fighting the people in South Sudan, it was also a very extremist Islamic-based government that was repressing and silencing and denying rights in Sudan itself to its own people. And eventually, the Sudanese people reached a point where not only were they tired of being stepped on, but at the end of 2018, the economic situation in the country got so bad that they decided they had nothing to lose, and they went out and protested in the streets and said, we are not going to allow this government to stay in power. It was almost like a replication of something called the Arab Spring that happened about 10 years ago. The Sudanese government shot unarmed protesters. It broke up the protests. They're still fighting against this, but in June, about 100 people were killed, possibly more. And everybody woke up and said, wait a second, these people are not fighting. They don't have weapons. They're basically sitting in the streets and marching, and this government is shooting them and basically using the same tactics that it had used over its 30-year period in power. And so we said, the Sudanese government needs to be isolated. It no longer should have access to weapons. And that is what we're trying to do now, because there's clearly a linkage between the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates and the current regime in Sudan and human rights violations and the Saudi government's activities in Yemen. In other words, there's the same attitude about we will sell weapons to whoever we want, whenever we want, irrespective of the cost in human lives. And that's where we come to this whole argument about regulating the arms trade. Guns and weapons are dangerous things. They have one main function, which is to kill and to cause harm. to treat them like any other product is simply a fallacy. It's a joke. And because of that, we believe that weapons and small arms should be regulated in a way that is different. We believe that U.S. arms exports from China, from the United Kingdom, from any country that manufactures weapons, should be treated differently from exporting radios and transistors or cars. Because if they get into the wrong hands, bad things happen. One of the reasons, one of the things that we've tried to argue for is that you have to have human rights criteria. When you engage in what we call security assistance, which is both the arms trade, arms exports, but also training of military officials, which is another separate factor, you have to ask the questions. Is this training going to make these people more efficient killers, or is it going to make them more responsible killers? What are you going to do to prevent the worst things from happening? Shouldn't you be responsible for selling something to somebody that ends up killing people? What are the mitigating laws and conditions that you're going to try to do to make the sale of those weapons minimized? Now, we started off by talking about one of the main drivers of displaced persons, conflict. When you talk about conflict and the damage it causes, you're not only talking about people, having to leave the country. You're talking about economic opportunities. You're talking about development. You're talking about women's rights. You're talking about children's rights. You're talking about infrastructure. You're talking about investment. You're talking about poverty. Everything is literally linked to the stability inside a country to basically progress and develop. And if guns and the sale of weapons and guns can destroy that, then we believe that there needs to be much more stringent oversight and control over that trade. And that's what we did with this arms trade treaty. We mobilized facts and figures. We mobilized civil society, that's rights groups like myself, church groups, whatever kind of associations that you can think of around the world. And we went to the governments and said, you need to regulate weapons, light arms, small arms, and you need to make sure that no one can sell to governments that have a record or there's a risk of human rights violations being committed. And that process led to an arms trade treaty in 2013. Now, the problem is that a lot of people will say that the arms trade treaty doesn't really do anything. And why would a country hold itself back from making money? Some of you may have heard our president talking about Saudi Arabia and saying they buy lots and lots of weapons. This is good for the US economy. And so why would I stop doing that? Forget about the moral questions with that answer. There's also a financial argument there that's not accurate. The actual arms industry and its contribution to American wealth is not as great as President Trump says. It is not a huge boost to the economy. It may be billions of dollars, but this is $1 trillion economy. This is not a life and death economic argument for the United States. It is a life and death argument for people in other parts of the world, but let's not talk about that. The other reason, critique about the arms trade is that countries like China, like Russia, countries in the former Eastern European countries that produce weapons are never going to comply with this treaty. That argument is like the one that says, well, what are human rights? What's the chance of China respecting human rights when China is a sovereign country? if you follow that argument, then absolutely nothing that we try to do to improve our lives makes sense, because you can't control any of the other factors. There's no accountability that you can impose, and there's it's basically a wasted effort. In other words, you take care of your little island continent, North America, and to hell with the rest of the world. Well, I would say that that's also a false argument, and I'll give you a good reason, a good example why. How many of you have heard of the term conflict diamonds? Okay, all right. Well, believe it or not, that thing that symbolizes love and romance, the diamond, has a very, very bad history associated with it. In most of the places where it's mined, there are terrible violations of the people who actually mine the diamonds, right? The other is that in many parts of the world where the diamonds are mined, they're usually in what we call human rights violation zones, right? And they actually have been controlled by armed groups, sold on the black market, and then they use their money to buy weapons and commit human rights violations. So in the early 90s, there was a big campaign to clean up diamonds, and conflict diamonds in particular. And all we said was we want to make sure that whatever diamond anybody here in the United States and around the world buys, we want to make sure there's no blood on it. In other words, we want to know where it was mined, who mined it, and to make sure that it was mined in a responsible way. In other words, there weren't child miners, there weren't people living in terrible conditions, and there wasn't any black market type activity. People said that that was a pretty stupid idea too, because the diamond industry was so powerful, and there were going to be countries that really didn't care about it. But surprise, surprise, there was a campaign that really educated people here and around the world about, do you really know where your diamond came from? People were a little disgusted and angry to find that their diamond could potentially have led to killings or the mutilation of kids. And suddenly, people were thinking, maybe I don't want to get a diamond. The diamond industry freaked out and said, we need to figure out how to save our product, because once the reputation of the diamond is spoiled as the symbol of love, the industry, it's completely a luxury item. Nobody needs a diamond. So if it's no longer a pure, lovely thing that symbolizes love, then nobody's going to buy them and the industry collapses. So they jumped. That kind of model doesn't happen all the time, but I think it's a very powerful argument that even the Arms Trade Treaty can make a difference. And it can make a difference because you have to educate people. You have to educate people so that they influence their governments, and they have to influence their governments to basically be responsible oversighers or do responsible oversight over their arms exports. And that's where you come back again to the United States. The United States is the largest exporter of weapons and manufacturer of weapons in the world. It has prided itself on having the best standards to make sure that their weapons, US weapons, made with your taxpayer dollars, when you start making money, are being used responsibly and are being sold responsibly. Well, surprise, surprise, a year ago, actually no, it started under the Obama administration. There was suddenly a decision that was going to be to change what the structure that governs US arms exports. You know, there are rules, you know, in other words, you have to say how many bullets you sold, how many guns, where they went to, who shipped them. There are structures, but one of the things, the oversight that we're interested in, the human rights criteria, was done by the Department of State. And that made sense because the Department of State focuses on recipients, the clients. Are they a stable government? Do they actually have systems to ensure that their weapons aren't going to be stolen, or that their weapons aren't going to be, diverted to the wrong places? And of course, do their security forces have a record of being responsible and not shooting people because they don't like them? The State Department was suddenly informed by the Obama administration that they were going to basically no longer do the oversight and that they were going to be transferring it to the Department of Commerce. Who can figure out why they would go to the Department of Commerce?
Doesn't it have like an easier restrictions where you could get through it easier, faster?
Exactly. And why would you want that?
So that it doesn't have like a chance of getting like rejected and so it could go through faster.
But what's the end result?
Money.
More guns sold, more money.
More money. Exactly. 2017, the United States exported more weapons than it had done since it kept records. Same thing happened in 2018. This is an article that came out just last week, so you should definitely look for it. I can give it to you. This is a booming business. Everybody wants a piece of it. Everybody's competing, absolutely. We know that. China, Russia, I mentioned it, the United Kingdom, France, Israel. Everybody who makes weapons wants that market. Everybody wants to push their product. It is a free-for-all. When we were doing our campaign, we actually found out that there were more regulations on the trade in bananas than there were in guns. We use that to a lot. We basically had bananas in all of our reports and documents, and we said, does that make sense that bananas have more trade regulations and restrictions than guns? But it was factually true. So anyway, the Obama administration announces this change and starts moving forward, and then something happens. The shooting at the school in Connecticut. And suddenly, everybody understands that more guns and relaxing guns doesn't look good, and the thing is shelved. And then the Trump administration comes into power, and suddenly the transfer has happened. It's now being overseen by the Department of Commerce. Groups like mine fought, we screamed, we kicked, we did everything we could, but it's under the authority of the executive branch. Congress also expressed its anger, said that this was not the right thing to do. They were concerned about the weakening of oversight and the weakening of human rights criteria. It's happened, and I suspect that in 2020, when we read about the reports of U.S. arms sales, we will find out that 2019 was a bumper year for U.S. exports. So we really do have a real challenge here that the United States, which is as the largest shareholder of the global arms trade market, is itself going in the wrong direction. Then what are we going to do with the arms trade and regulating it? And the weakest countries, unfortunately, are the ones that are suffering the most. You're not going to see countries like Mali or Burkina Faso or the Central African Republic being able to say, you've got to keep weapons out of our countries, because they don't have the power to do that. And they also don't have the money to stop it. So I'd like to end by saying that, before we do the Q&A, I'd like to end by saying that we're not idealists in saying that there shouldn't be an arms trade. We know that is going to happen. But we do believe that a responsible arms trade can make a huge difference, that it is not, and it's not just possible, it's a moral, it's moral and it's rational. You can't have the same people selling weapons to countries in the Americas and then not understand why you have a refugee and humanitarian crisis on the southern border. They're linked. You can't have destabilization happening in huge parts of Africa and not understand why poverty and education levels and health levels continue to be abysmally low and not see the correlation. And we believe that that educated constituents around the world in these manufacturing countries and exporting countries should be the ones to basically say, we understand that you're going to do this, but you're going to bloody well do it in as safe and responsible a way as possible. I'll end by giving you one last interesting statistic. There is one group that's involved in promoting and pushing all of these changes to loosen oversight of US exports. It's also very involved in guns in the United States. Does anybody know which group I'm talking about?
NRA?
The National Rifle Association has been part of US delegations to international arms trade negotiations. Why? Because they're powerful. They fund people in government. They have a constituency. And the NRA is on record as saying that anything that impedes gun sales around the world threatens gun sales in the United States, and we cannot have that. That's kind of scary. So we need to, but we need to be aware of that. And we also, I think, finally, just by saying that, if we don't actually agree that we all benefit when there's peace and security, when there's no violence and when there's conflict, which is in the national security documents for the United States as policy objectives, then I think we have a bigger problem than we realize. So I'm going to stop there. I hope that I've said stuff that makes you argue, or, well, you guys won't have a problem with that, but let me see if I can answer any questions.
Do you think the United States can use any, do they have any leverage in, relations with countries in order for them to stop these, crimes, but still allow the governments to essentially use their arms to stop, non-state actors, people?
This administration is incredibly bilateral, yeah? In other words, they do not respect and they do not like to be part of multilateral agreements, which is why they're pulling back from so many things. The United States, since the Second World War, was able to pull and push coalitions of governments together when it wanted to. It still can do that. I think that there's still, especially on this particular issue of the trade and oversight of the trade, I think the United States still has the ability to find enough pressure and enough support with other governments to basically do the right thing. But I'll be honest, this particular administration doesn't seem to know how to do multilateral negotiations, and they don't care. So it may not be this administration, but we cannot let them destroy what took years of negotiations to try to build consensus on the fact that responsible arms sales need to be a minimum standard.
Which region in Africa receives most sales and what type of sales is there?
I guess the primary conflict zones where you see an inflow of weapons are Sudan and South Sudan. And those are weapons coming from China and from Russia. They are coming from, diverted through allies in Uganda, which gets weapons from the United States also. You have, unfortunately, conflicts. Many of you may know of a group called Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, a terrible armed group which is bent on establishing an Islamic extremist caliphate. Their source of weapons actually comes from what used to be controlled by Libya and Muammar Gaddafi. Muammar Gaddafi was the former head of state of Libya. He was a dictator. He had oil, and he was able to purchase weapons from anyone he wanted to because he paid cash. He got weapons from countries in Eastern Europe and from France. When he fell, all of those weapons suddenly vanished. Huge arsenal, and they just proliferated all the way down through the Sahara, and suddenly small little groups that were fighting over land and grazing rights suddenly had AK-47s. That's where Boko Haram is getting its weapons. They're using whatever methods they can, extortion, kidnapping, but they are buying weapons that have flooded that market. And that's the classic example of what happens when you don't have responsible arms sales and you don't manage weapons. But those would be that region, West Africa, northern Nigeria, all the way to Cameroon, is basically impacted by arms caches that came from Libya. Then you have right next to it is Sudan, and as I mentioned, Russia, China, and some of the European countries The Czech Republic, for example, sells weapons. Serbia sells weapons. And then I think the other big market would be, well, that's the wrong word, but the other big region, of course, is where are the weapons coming from in Somalia, the former Somalia. Where is El Shabaab, which is another armed group that is fighting against what is the government in what is one part of Somalia and the United Nations and the African Union, and their weapons have to be coming through Yemen from the Gulf states.
Why do you say small countries don't have the power system?
If you look at the control of borders, the baseline is the borders are hard to control, right? The United States is having this, it wants to build a wall on the southern border. It's not logical. It's too long, and it would bankrupt the country. If a country as wealthy as the United States can't really prevent people from coming in and out, then these other smaller, less financially able governments are going to have a hard time. And the countries in Africa, the governments in Africa are incredibly weak. One of the reasons that you have conflict in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Nigeria, is because the governments doesn't really have a presence except in the large cities. In other words, the border is literally trees there, and then the other side is Chad or whatever it is. So people come and go. That's always been the way, and that's going to be the way it is. So of course there's smuggling going back and forth. There's always going to be an infiltration of weapons into countries. That kind of oversight you can only start to really change if you have the resources and coordination amongst regions. And that's why this treaty will help them. Basically, it helps by at least making sure that weapons that export tell you who they're exporting to, and they tell you how much they're exporting. If I sell you, if my document to you says I'm giving you 5 million guns, and then you get 2 million guns, there are 3 million guns that are anywhere in this room, and we don't know how to track them. So and these countries don't have the technology. One of the things of the treaty was basically to help by strengthening record keeping and by accounting mechanisms and tracking things. That's when all of that gets lost when you go to these poor countries that are literally unable to pay their own domestic salary.
Does your group focus on other solutions for conflicts that arms sales try to solve? For example, keeping these non-state actors suppressed.
That's very provocative language. Suppressed. I work for a rights group. We wouldn't use that word, but we do also. We hold non-state actors accountable just as we do governments. We understand that they're different, that they don't actually. Sometimes you can't even get in touch with them, but there are rules of responsible behavior that even they are supposed to accept. We do also engage in ways to try to, well, let me put it this way. Our work is always focused on protecting rights violations from happening. And so in whatever way we see non-state actors doing things, or state actors helping non-state actors do things, then we will protest. And we do engage in what I would call advocacy to those governments, to the regional actors. In Africa's case, it would be to the African Union, or even at the regional level, to ECOWAS, which is West Africa, to the East African Union, and also to the Southern African Union, basically to say, hey, country X is supporting this armed group, or a country X, we have documented that they are allowing these groups to operate from within their national boundaries. We believe that this group is committing human rights violations. You guys have to do something about it. We don't have the power to do it ourselves, but what we can do is expose what's going on.
And does the United States give foreign military aid to these regions that you mentioned that are fighting the war in Europe?
Yes. The United States has assistance programs in the war against terror, which of course we don't have details on because they're secret. One of the big ones that I've been working on has been the one, again, in West Africa, which includes Chad, Niger, Nigeria, Cameroon, and we've basically been telling them that not only is there a risk of diversion of the weapons that they're giving them because of the lack of oversight, but also we also have expressed concerns about the performance of the troops in all of these countries. These troops don't seem to care whether you are Boko Haram or not. They shoot first and then ask questions later. So we do believe that those kinds of programs need more transparency. They need to be publicly shared. We also believe that military and security tactics alone is not going to beat terrorism. And so we believe that this is where the issue of rights and civil society and political space and dialogue all come into play.
So with the foreign military aid, is it the United States just giving the weapons and giving the military assistance, or is it them giving the country loans so that they can buy weapons?
It's both. Yeah, there are foreign military sales and there's foreign military assistance. They will actually give you a loan to buy their weapons. It is the classic capitalist approach. Create demand, facilitate demand, and provide, and then answer the demand.
Sorry to interrupt.
We're
We're going
done.
to start wrapping up pretty
Yes.
soon? Yeah. Give you a couple more minutes.
Yes, no,
Questions?
I don't know whether there are any other questions or anything that I didn't cover that, like any big gaps in questions?
It's not specifically a question, but I was wondering, like, is there any, like, email that we could use to contact you?
Yes. My email is aakwei @aiusa.org. Absolutely, feel free to reach out to me. There are all sorts of other groups. Do you want me to repeat that? Yes. Oh, sorry. AAK, all lowercase. AAKWEI @aiusa.org. Please do feel free to reach out to me. Harass me, because I do sometimes forget, I get too many emails. But if there are resources that or my organization has a lot of stuff, and we're all part of there's a coalition of groups that are working on security assistance and arms sales. Other groups? Yes. There's one of your speakers, Jeff Abramson, has something called a Forum on Arms Trade. Definitely go to that website and dive through there and reach out to anybody on that list to give you specific resources. There is controlarms.org, which is the global coalition that really came together from around the world to fight for the arms trade treaty. If you are particularly given to reading boring texts and technical texts, you can go to the Arms Trade Treaty website of the United Nations. It's probably not a bad thing to look at to sort of see how governments have shaped this. But then I would also suggest that you look at the websites of ActionAid and Oxfam, humanitarian organizations that were involved in the ATT work. Because the bottom line is, it's not enough to look at this through the sales and the actual items. You have to keep the humans in it. You have to look at the people, right? Which means you have to look at the impact. And that means reading the stories about what has happened in countries where conflict and weapons have destroyed things. Because it's only then that you really begin to understand how horrible it is. When we were doing the ATT work, we brought, not we, but World Vision, which is a humanitarian organization, brought some children from Sierra Leone to come and show what was going on. And I remember the first time I saw the kids, it was in the distance, maybe just like in the hallway there, and they were absolutely adorable until they just turned. And you saw that one of them didn't have an arm, one of them didn't have a leg. These were 7-year-olds, you know? And suddenly you realize, ooh, this is not theoretical, this is not technical, you know? This is where people die, where people are just devastated. And that's why you have to really take, you can't take this on. I know you're doing it as part of a debate, but you basically have to remember to remind people that human lives are impacted by what you do and what you don't do. I'll probably stop there because I probably run out of my time.
Yeah, let's thank our speaker today. We're going to take a quick break and we're going to have a speaker on Israel coming down. It's a big affirmative on this topic and certainly an interesting issue. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Pleasure to have you. I think we have your colleague actually.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Wonderful.
So I'll go grab him real quick.
There's a bottle that has to be hanging down.
You're like,
what does your handwriting look like? Okay, write something right now. We have a. I'm gonna get a pen. Write something right now. I should have told you that. Right up here. Speaker, what speaker number is it? It's speaker 7, is it? 6? Speaker 6 is wrong at the top. I'm just right here. I mean, right hand, left hand is 4 times.